Hi everyone and welcome to my Season 25 Inner Mystic Ally guide. So if you thought that Innas was already really strong in Season 24, then prepare for this. Now it's going to be absolutely annihilating everything. So we have seen this on the PTR already, and with the soul shards in Season 25, Innas is just completely out of control. And there was a slight bump down in the final patch notes to some of them, but it doesn't really change the overall picture. With this build, you will be able to clear GR150 solo quite reliably without really having a very strong character. So I expect that as early as something like Paragon 1k, 1500 or so, if you're trying a bit, you will be able to do it. And this is probably the easiest it's ever been. So with this guide, I want to give you what's needed to destroy the highest tiers in the game. And on top of that, Innas is also simply the best build when it comes to T16 farming, bounties farming, solo XP. It basically does it all, and I expect that it's also going to be the most popular by far in Season 25. Theoretically, Innas is outclassed by one other build, which is the Akan's Bombardment Crusader with Thorns, but there are not enough Greater Rift tiers in the game to actually make that other build really shine. And there is a bit of competition, especially from wudijo Witch Doctor in 4-man, and theoretically the Bombardment as well. As far as other XP metas go, there is competition from rat runs, but I don't really think they're going to be so popular because Innas is super fun and it's shiny and it just destroys. So I'll walk you through the setups here. I have a defeat planner with lots of different variations because there are actually some choices you can do. Most importantly, you need to have the Innas set. So you have 6 pieces here that gives you big buffs for having mystic allies, and you spawn extra mystic allies. You get a few small buffs like extra mantras and some damage reduction and these kind of things. And you have a few key items that are important to buff the mystic ally damage. Most importantly, the crudest boots gives you a 200% multiplier and also makes them last longer in case of the water allies. And there's also the bindings of the lesser gods, which again gives a 200% damage bonus and times 5 of that for fire allies. So there are 2 different variations, there's water and there's fire. In general, in high GRs, you will always play fire. They simply deal a lot more damage. They have a rather small AoE. And water allies are mostly confined to T16 stuff and very low GRs if you just want to rush through in like less than a minute. Aside from those items, most of the setup is actually fairly open for some options. So for example, for a tanky variant, you can have the Lefebvre's Soliloquy, which gives you 50% damage reduction after casting Cyclone Strike. There's also Spirit Guard for another 60% damage reduction. So this is kind of like the entry level tanky version of the build. If you are a little bit further progressed and more familiar with the build, you can also swap those 2 out for Orgals. This gives you another like 2 tiers or so of damage, but you lose like 70% of your toughness, which is still manageable once you are comfortable with the build. One quite important multiplier that you need to play around is the Shenlong's set. So here you want to get to full spirit, and then you get a debuff that gives you lots of minus spirit regeneration, and once you drop down to 0, you lose the buff again. Now the thing is, it's actually quite easy to activate this. You have 250 maximum spirit if you don't have any maximum spirit from your passes or your paragon or your items. And when you press Mystic Ally, you get 200 spirit for free, so 80% of the entire pool. So it's actually very easy to activate this. Either you are already in the Shenlong's window, so you'll just refill your spirit, or you are not yet in Shenlong's. And unless you are basically at 0 spirit whatsoever, you will get the Shenlong's buff right away after pressing the button, and you will get the damage buff for the explosions. So it's quite easy to do. The only real problem comes when you don't have Shenlong's active and you have almost no spirit, or you're casting Cyclone Strike in the same moment, because then you might actually not get the buff after pressing the button. So you might have to look at your spirit here and there, and as long as you're somewhere at like 20% or so, or 10%, you can just punch a little bit and then press Mystic Allies and you get Shenlongs. It's quite simple. If you really don't want to play with Shenlongs, there are also some Daibo variations, but they will be weaker. So here we can go with the Captain Crimson because you have an extra set piece. You wear the Daibo, which also has 100% extra Mystic Ally damage, which is quite massive. So that kind of gives you some of the damage back that you lose from the Shenlongs, but those variations will be weaker and you definitely go down a few tiers from having this convenience of not having Shenlongs. As far as the jewelry goes, you basically always have the Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube because you usually combine the set with something else. So in this case you have the Crimson here, we have the Orgels here, or you just have an extra like armor slot. For example, you have double braces here, so you want to make sure that you have the full 6-piece bonus with this. As for the jewelry, you usually have an endless walk with a combination of elements. So in a slow-paced pushing build, you actually play around the combination of element cycle, which is 20 seconds. There's 5 elements on the monk. And every 20 seconds, you prepare your Shenlongs, you prepare a pull, cycle and strike it together, and activate your bindings of lesser gods. And then you press the Mystic Ally and go boom. So this is how that works. There are some faster variations of that with Messerschmitts and lots more cooldown. So essentially here you can explode every few seconds. You don't play around conventional elements. So this is a variation you're going to see especially in foreman parties for speed farming all the way to GR150 most likely, or very close to that. And here you go focus on restraint and squirts, so you can move around freely, you don't have endless walk, and you also don't have to worry about the combination of elements. Instead, you will have Messerschmitt's Reaver, and you will reset your cooldowns or your other monk's cooldowns in a party with those explosions, and you can essentially just pop it every few seconds. Theoretically, when you're having trouble surviving in parties, you could do the same adjustments as in a solo push setup, so dropping the Orgels, but you have the party buffs, it should not really a big deal there. There are also some other speed variations that you can do, so there's the water speeds, where, for example, you have Ingeum, Echoing Fury, so no Shenlongs, no Daibo, you just like go really fast, you dash around, and you just activate your Mystic Allies regularly. There's the fire speeds that kind of work similarly, so you go quite a lot of tiers higher here, but it has the same setup. And there's also the Wonkum Lao speeds, which is probably not really recommended, but it's probably something a lot of people played in Season 24, so I kept this setup here as well. So the idea is that you use Tempest Rush with a Ring of the Zodiac to reset your Mystic Ally cooldowns, and you can also just explode like every few seconds here. Now for your legendary gems, you usually have the Bane of the Trapped and the Enforcer. This is just the most damage. The Mystic Allies are treated as pets, so this actually works. And in pushing, you usually want to go for Bane of the Stricken to be able to finish off the boss especially. Sometimes you can also finish off some elites with that because you punch really fast, especially when Flying Dragon procs, which is giving you double attack speed. So this is one of the other pretty important items here that you use for pushing instead of the Messerschmitt's Reaver. And then you can get like 5 stricken stacks a second. In speedruns with a lot of cooldown reduction, you can also go for the Go-Go or Swiftness, which gives you some extra damage through the attack speed and the extra cooldown, and also some dodge, which helps keeping up the scores a little bit more. One thing I should mention about the group setups with Shenlong is that you can also go with this more solo push oriented version with Flying Dragon instead of Messerschmitt's Reaver and play around the convention cycle again. You can also go with Endless Walk again theoretically. That depends a little bit on the exact runs that you're doing. So if you are going really fast and you're just destroying like 2-3 minute runs or something, then this is fine to go with lower cooldown. But if you, for example, struggle to kill the boss really fast, then it's definitely fine to replace Go-Go with a Stricken again. It's definitely fine to go with Flying Dragon again and even play around COEs. So that depends a little bit on how far you are with your progress and what you're trying to do with your group. In terms of skills and passives, there is not really that much that changes between the setups. So you basically always have Beacon of Etar for the extra cooldown. You basically always have Seize the Initiative. And then you usually have something like a Unity for DPS. You can also go with the 2 defensive passives here. So for example, in the dual wielding setups, Guardian's Path is extremely good for the extra dodge. There are also some other defensive passives. There is Sixth Sense that gives you a lot of damage reduction against non-physical. There's Near Death Experience if you want to cheat death. There are also Momentum for extra damage. There's Harmony. So you actually have a bunch of really good options here depending on what you like the most. For your skills, you have the Mystic Allies, so either the Fire or the Water rune depending on what you're playing. There's the Serenity usually, which gives you immunity. This is especially important on the Squirt's Necklace setups. You have to have the Cyclone Strike to activate the Bindings of the Lesser Gods. Also allows you to make pulls much more easily. You have Wave the 100 Fists with Assimilation. So typically you try to punch in the direction of the most enemies. That gives you this additive damage buff. So in some good pulls you can get something like double damage just from that alone. You usually have Dashing Strike as well. There are 2 different runes possible. So it's Blinding Speed, and the other one is Radiance that gives you 15% attack speed. So this is usually a very costly trait, but you can do it if you're tanky enough. And there is a last skill slot that either is Inner Sanctuary or Epiphany. So typically I recommend Inner Sanctuary here with Temple of Protection. Essentially, once you set up your pull and you want to stand still with the Endless Walk, especially in pushing, you can just pop the Inner Sanctuary and then let enemies walk towards you, cycle them together. And then as your fire COE cycle approaches, you can press Serenity. And then once Serenity runs out, you press your Mystic Ally. So this is the idea there. So you can use Inner Sanctuary first, stand still for a little while, be tanky, and then use the Serenity to survive the rest. The other option is to just go with Epiphany, which is just easier to use, so you don't have to worry about anything there. You just have this, and it gives you this permanent 50% damage reduction. Makes it a bit easier, but it also might not be up all the time, so you have quite long downtimes in some cases. So I don't really recommend that in a push. There's one more special setup I should highlight, which is the water bounties. So here you have the Raiment 4-piece bonus. You have 3 of those set items equipped, you have the Daibo equipped, and this allows you to combine it with the inner set. And the reason for that is you have infinite dashing strike as long as you have enough resources. So you stack a lot of resource cost and cooldown reduction and also a bit of spirit regeneration. You use Guardian's Path that gives you another 50% spirit regeneration when wearing a Daibo. You have stuff like Mantra of Healing with Circular Breathing for spirit regeneration. You spam Mystic Ally as much as possible to get the flat 200 every time you activate it. You have Epiphany inside. So here you can dash around a lot once you optimize your setup, and this is basically the fastest bounty farming build in the game. When you have 4 monks like this and they all have a good setup, you can do a full set of bounties, all 5 acts, in as little as 5 or 6 minutes or so if you have a good party. So this is really fast, and I have already made some other videos talking about this in particular. And the good part is this setup is straight up just stronger than in Season 24 because now you have the soul shards and previously you didn't have an ethereal. For your stat priorities, you generally want to reach at least 33% cooldown reduction because this is what you need to play a 20-second cycle of Mystic Ally. In some cases you want to go for a lot more cooldown, especially on the speed variations where you have the Messerschmitt's Reaver. So this applies to like the group speeds, for example. You want to stack a lot of cooldown reduction just to improve the value of the Messerschmitt there and be able to explode much more often. Other than that, attack speed is actually a very good stat. So especially on the gloves, this is a good option. Sometimes on the rings when you don't need the cooldown there. So for example, for these pushing variations, you can do something like this. Or you can also go with the flat physical damage. This is quite useful on those rings because you will cap out to 5 attacks per second when Flying Dragon is up in some cases. So Flying Dragon, it effectively just takes your sheet APS and multiplies it by 2. So when you reach something like around 2.5 attacks per second, you will get to 5, and this is the cap. So you don't really need to have much more than that, and you can rather stack more of those damage stats. On the other hand, extra attack speed, even when Flying Dragon is down, helps you to proc it more often, so it's not really a lost stat in general. Aside from this, life per hit is actually quite a good stat, but not really that important with the Season 25 soul shards because you already get a lot of life per hit there. But you can roll it especially on your weapons or maybe on the bracer here and there for those pushing variations, or you just go with cooldown plus attack speed and you'll also be fine. Missing other damage is quite important, so you want to have that on the shoulder and on the chest. And aside from this, you have like the typical crit stats and like the elemental rolls on your amulet and braces, and this is about it. Now for the gameplay, I've already described this a little bit earlier. In general, you need to make sure that you apply the Bindings of the Lesser Gods debuff, because especially for the fire ally variation of the build, this is a massive damage buff. It gives you like times 10 or something, and you will not do any damage if you don't do that. So all the enemies that are supposed to get this debuff need to be like closely stacked around you. What you need to know is that Cyclone Strike can only pull maximum of 16 targets, but you actually damage everything around you, and the damaging part is what matters for the bracers. So even if there's a large pull, don't worry, just make sure you Cyclone Strike in the middle somewhere, or maybe even apply like 2 Cyclone Strikes or so. However, especially the fire allies have very small AoE radius, so you don't really benefit much from making these large pulls. In fact, Inners, especially with the fires, is usually played with small pulls, so this is really where it excels because of the small AoE. And also when you have 2 large pulls, your fire allies too easily get distracted or stuck and don't actually really explode as they should be. So instead you should try to maybe find an elite and a bit of trash monsters around or something, or just some medium-sized pack of trash, blast it down and move on. You have the damage to destroy everything, and this is usually how it's played in a push. Compared to most other builds, you don't have to kite the entire floor with you and fight 5 elite packs at a time and like 100 monsters or something. Instead, just go in, make a little pull, make sure you keep up your endless walk if you're playing with this, so try to stand still a little bit, use the inner sanctuary for example in the serenity, and then you go for the explosion and move on to the next pull. Also keep in mind that the Mystic allies have a bit of a delay before they explode, so you usually press a button and then it takes something like a second or up to 2 seconds for them to actually do their thing. So depending on whether they get stuck and run around a little bit, essentially they just spawn all around you and then they seek a target. And sometimes you might also be dashing around, and if you do that, then the fire allies might be targeted to some of the old targets that you left behind and try to run to those. This is usually something you want to avoid, so generally when you try to do the explosion, you want to stand still or like not really go too far for like a second or two, so that your Mystic allies actually have a chance to finish their rotation. In any case, use your dashing strike every few seconds or so to get the buff, so either get a dodge or the attack speed bonus, which is very nice. Use Epiphany when you need the extra defense when you have it, or the inner sanctuary for the combo with Serenity, and this is how you survive the best. Aside from this, it really just comes down to learning the build a little bit in case you haven't played it before. So you need to get a feel for how the Mystic allies actually work and how they seek targets and these kind of things, what pulls work and what don't. But in general, Innas is extremely powerful in Season 25. You're gonna be annihilating GRs and it's not really gonna be such a big deal. But one thing to note is that with the Flying Dragon RNG, sometimes the damage will be much higher than other times, and also with the Mystic allies sometimes not really going for the right targets. It can really happen that sometimes you do an explosion and you really wonder what just happened because you didn't do anything. So this happens, but for the most part you will just do so much damage that, for example, like 1 or 2 of these guys are enough to just finish off some monsters, and then like everything around you will just be annihilated. If you're really ambitious for solo pushing with the Flying Dragon, you can try to actually open your character details and look at whether you have the buff or not, because there's no UI indicator. You have to look at your sheet damage, and if it's doubled or roughly doubled compared to usual, you know that you have the Flying Dragon, and then you can press the Mystic ally. But that is obviously a little bit hard to coordinate in the heat of the moment when you are still learning the build. But for more advanced players, this is definitely something you want to do to try to give you like another opportunity to block the Flying Dragon and double your damage for one rotation. And that's also pretty much it for this guide. Personally, I'm looking forward to playing a little bit of Monk. I'm probably gonna start with it, have a 150 done, and then I'm probably gonna swap to Demon Hunter right after. So I expect to do this in like the first few days of the season or so. And I also hope that you guys are gonna have a lot of fun to build. It's gonna be a cool speed firing meta in my opinion. So I'm quite pumped for Season 25 in general. The soul shards are amazing. So I wish you guys a good start in Season 25. Hope you enjoyed this video and see you guys next time.